All righty. Thank you guys so much for joining us for today's training event. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that there is an option for you to have closed captions. You just click on the three little dots, more ellipses, and you can turn those on for your viewing pleasure if you would like. I know I leave them on. And also that this training is being recorded. And if you would not like to be recorded, unfortunately, the only way for you to opt out is by not attending the meeting. But the recording will be posted on the site website. Also, I want to let you know that we do ask that you stay muted throughout today's training just to kind of minimize any disruptions as Sam is doing his training. So if I might mute you, and please don't take an offense to it. All right, I'm just gonna, just try to make sure that we don't cause any disruptions. But on that note, I would like to turn it over to Sam.
Thank you, James. Hey, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Sam Buckhalter. I am a technical specialist with Microsoft, and I have a focus on security, compliance, and identity stacks here in the Microsoft 365 world. I've asked James to help me triage the chat window. So if you have questions, please, by all means, ask them kind of in line as we're going. He'll go ahead and interrupt me when it makes sense, and we can kind of address those as it works out. We have a pretty small crowd, so if there's anything, hot topics or anything you want to know specifically, definitely let me know. But with that, we're here to talk a little bit about protecting your school data and digital assets in the remote world and what that looks like. And kind of starting off, want to discuss a little bit about what the landscape looks overall, both in kind of the Microsoft world and then the threat landscape out there too. So Microsoft, we've got a very unique insight into the world of signals and telemetry out there. You may have come across some of our zero trust discussions in the past where we talk a lot about shifting our security methodology and our security perimeters away from that kind of old school methodology of firewalls and local networks and where you're trusting someone because they're on that network. And if they're on that network, they belong there, and giving them access to kind of all resources that are on that network. And kind of transitioning that to our zero trust type models, where instead of trusting someone because of the network you're on, you're actually not trusting them because of the network and looking at all variations of that session, that user, what makes that that session unique and potentially risky, and validating that at a detailed level so that you can dynamically change that where it's appropriate. And so the way we do that, or the insight Microsoft has in there, is we're seeing over 1 billion PCs, servers, IoT devices connected to Microsoft infrastructure. We're looking at petabytes of other external cloud logs and network logs are able to be ingested into your Microsoft 365 world. The billions of apps and services and users that are connecting, and the broad level of different platforms, whether it's Windows or Windows Server or mobile devices from iOS and Android or Linux, and even all the new and emerging IoT devices that are scattering the infrastructure world these days. With all of those categories, we're getting trillions of signals, whether it's the URLs that people are using to try to phish your users and trick them into going to websites that look like something that's legit, but they're really looking for your credentials. We're seeing billions of meetings executed every month. We're getting hundreds of billions of authentication events, which I love that number because it just shows the scale of authentications we see and the risk around that. Some of our competitors have even come out and they've kind of advertised their authentication figures, where it's in that kind of 8 billion a year range. We do that on a daily basis. We do more than that on a daily basis. So that number is really a big one, and for level of risk and insight we see just from an authentication perspective. But of course, the threats that are being blocked, the emails that are being analyzed that you see in scales that's hard to replicate. And we take all of those signals on their own, and we're able to put that into our machine learning capabilities and AI to do predictions on what's threatening behavior, what is a risk, and use that to take actions to help you make sure that your data, your school is as secure as possible. So this last year was unprecedented. We all know that. Really just wanted to highlight attackers take those types of opportunities. In this case, it's a pandemic. It's attackers and cyber criminals are leveraging the issues of the day, the headlines, to scale up and find new avenues to take advantage of people, compromise accounts, make their way into your infrastructure, your assets. And really, this is just showing the increase in spikes that were correlated or that we saw observed and correlated with the events of the pandemic and the first cases, the travel bans that occurred, and kind of when things went quiet a little bit going into summer and then peaked back at the end of the year as well. Cybercrime kind of follows similar suits. They take advantage, they're opportunistic. So, and also a few years ago, criminals were basically, or cyber criminals, were targeted a little bit more on the malware side. That was where they were getting a lot of return on investment for their efforts. That shifted over the last few years before pandemics, but of course that's kind of stemmed it even further. But we've shifted more to the identity and credential harvesting type attacks, and you see a lot of that. I mean, we've all had the Microsoft spam calls where organizations are pretending to be Microsoft, but that's also proliferating with UPS and Amazon, Apple, and Zoom. Those are some of the top 5 brands that are being impersonated and mimicked or spoofed in order to compromise your end users. And this is something that's really been hitting hard. Education and healthcare are a couple I've been tracking, and we've been tracking in our threat analytics too. Really just where that's hitting hard. And these are complex, it's not just simple automated attacks. These are actually human driven in a lot of cases, and they're moving laterally in environments, really kind of digging around to harvest all the credentials that they can to release the biggest payload and get the biggest return on investment. So a couple other sample threats. Really, it's espionage, disruption, and destruction are kind of the targets and things people, cyber criminals, are doing to get in your environment or really targeting within your environment. Whether it's using common impersonation techniques. You notice here on the bottom screenshot, you've got domains where they've gone out and purchased things that could be easily mistaken if you're not reading close for, like, Microsoft here. It's an RN instead of an M. So really unique and clever new attacks. So ransomware is also becoming very high impact. It's one of the most common scenarios that our DART team, detection and response team, has been called out for, is triaging and remediating ransomware type infections to get our customers back into a good, healthy state. And again, that's that human driven threat. That's the big uptech. It's not just someone clicks a bad file, their OneDrive or their local machine gets hit with ransomware. These are orchestrated attacks where people are starting off with that phishing campaign, compromising credentials. They're then using that compromised credentials in order to find other user accounts and hopefully admin permissions. They're moving laterally to on-prem resources to try to find things like domain controllers and domain admin accounts to really target and launch ransomware attacks in the most impactful way possible. So it's really growing quite a bit. And of course, just kind of malware by industry. You notice this big blue ocean over here of 62%. Education just gets hit hard with all of these. A lot of it's challenging to be able to implement some basic security features in education, whether maybe it's young kids that don't have cell phones that can't easily leverage things like multi-factor authentication, which in and of itself is able to prevent so many of the common attacks. It's a difficult thing to do in the education industry. And so education's traditionally targeted for really a lot of attacks. Kind of talk to that. Looking back last year, we saw a big uptick, of course, in those identity attacks come May and June, but we also saw an uptick in multi-factor as people embrace the work at home and education at home, classes at home, really turning on multi-factor authentication. That became a much bigger trend where possible, and trying to make that as easy as possible. But there's still challenges there that can be difficult to overcome. So the big question is, how does Microsoft 365 A5 help, and what can we do to make lives easier, make your infrastructure more secure, and what does that solution look like? And so a couple key themes here is really built-in experiences that work across platforms. It's not just a Microsoft world. It would be naive to think that. Most schools, most companies, most healthcare organizations, they're embracing multi-cloud environments, and you need security solutions and all up solutions that work cross-cloud with both first party to Microsoft as well as third parties with our partners and other solutions out there. So cross-platform's a common theme where Microsoft has made quite a bit of investment in over the years, and you'll see that as we go through some of these products. Of course, adding in AI and automation. We're all short-staffed, whether it's the school that has a built-out extensive security team where they might have dedicated personnel to that and still need to alleviate workload, but probably the more common scenario is the one-man shop or one-person shop, I should say, where you have limited resources, you're wearing many hats, you don't have a dedicated security team. You need to leverage the tools at hand to automate as much as possible in your remediation and alleviate the hands-on keyboard for every alert, every threat. And then integrating cross people, whether it's that user, different devices, a sea of apps, and your data, whether it's local and on your machine in a Microsoft cloud or in Dropbox or Box, wherever that data resides, it's protecting that data. So the way we do that, we break our thinking out into 4 big categories here. We've got our identity and access management. That's looking at the user. Who is this user? What's the risk of their login? Where are they coming from? What device are they coming from? Are you managing that device? Is it encrypted? All of those components go into assessing the risk and the device health of that session, that user login. You've got your threat protection. It's stopping the attacks at hand, whether it's from a link in an email or it's something that hit your Windows workstation or Mac workstation from an endpoint perspective. Showing that kind of automated components with our SIEM solutions and cross detection response. So you're detecting laterally across different areas, whether it's your workstation, you're correlating that with identity threats in the cloud, with identity threats on-prem, with the emails you're getting and the threats coming in from those different avenues. Then you have information protection, looking at the data and what that data has, what sensitive information is there, what would be at risk if it was leaked or made it out to the news. Maybe you're protecting student social security numbers or student identification numbers or medical record numbers. It's identifying that data and making sure that it is access is encrypted, restricted, and protected no matter where that data goes. And then lastly, we've got our cloud security category, safeguarding not just the Microsoft cloud, but all of those third-party apps you have, protecting on-prem apps, things that legacy stuff that you might have to VPN in to get to today, being able to protect that and treat those web apps like modern cloud applications. So with that, we've got a handful of products. So Microsoft 365, we spent a lot of investment last year into unifying the platform. So we've got Microsoft 365 Defender, and that comprises of a number of truly best-in-breed products, things you don't have to sacrifice. You don't have to sacrifice on quality. These are widely seen as best-of-breed products in the industry. And so we've got Microsoft Defender for Identity. That was previously known as Azure ATP for anyone that's familiar with licensing from a year or so back. That's bringing in your on-prem identity component. So it's a little agent. It gets deployed on your domain controllers on premises. And that's bringing insight of, hey, where have attacks moved laterally? Where are we seeing hash the hash type hacks or credential harvesting, where that attacker is trying to get access and control of other accounts in your environment? The next one is Microsoft Defender for Endpoints. This previously was known as Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection. And the key here is it's cross-platform. This is Windows 10, of course. It's built into Windows, not bolted on. So you get that great integrated built-on experience. But we also fully support Mac OS. We support Linux and Android, and even iOS is currently in preview today. So really made the investments to provide endpoint protection, a full endpoint protection and endpoint detection and response platform for all of your endpoints, whether it's Microsoft, Apple, Linux, mobile, or even on the server front. Now, Microsoft Cloud App Security, that's how we protect our cloud apps. And fortunately, we had one product that was not renamed. If you're familiar with Cloud Access Security Brokers, or CASBs, Microsoft Cloud App Security is the Microsoft CASB solution. It's the best CASB from Microsoft that loves third parties. It's kind of a parting line there. So it's not just a Microsoft world. You can integrate AWS to that. You can integrate Google Cloud. You can integrate Dropbox, Box. I mean, the list goes on, and we'll dive into that in a little bit here. But really, it's a CASB for your cloud world, and third parties are a huge part of that. The last component, user data, protecting user data. So we have Microsoft Defender for Office 365. This might have, or I guess there's a typo in this, I apologize. This was actually formerly known as Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection. This is traditionally where you would think of email protection, safe links, safe attachments, doing zero-day detonation chambers, things of that nature. But little known fact, it actually works natively with our cloud solutions too. So it's protecting you, whether you have documents in OneDrive or SharePoint, or maybe you're working in Teams, or even natively into your Office 365 desktop apps, the Word, Excels, and PowerPoints. Defender for Office 365 natively works with those too. So as you have a link you're putting in that PowerPoint presentation, you're prepping for tomorrow afternoon, that link is protected with safe links. If you're dealing with attachments that you just uploaded in, or a file you uploaded to your OneDrive, that OneDrive, if it's a risky file, it'll be executed in a detonation chamber to make sure that that is a safe file that you have. So really, the reason we made this investment into the Microsoft 365 Defender platform and kind of transition some of our naming is really to accentuate the unification of our security solution cross-platform across all of these categories together. And we've shifted away from those silos to a truly integrated cross-domain security model. And what that gets you a single pane of glass, that one portal. And of course, we've had previous portals for each one of these products in the past. Those are getting consolidated down. And actually, even just a few weeks back, we made huge leaps in that consolidation with our security.microsoft.com portal, where it truly is really your one-stop shop, and it gives you that unified portal experience we've all been wanting, that is so hard to achieve when you're leveraging 10, 15, 50 different security apps. So one portal, being able to coordinate those threats from different avenues. If a threat starts in email, being able to correlate that to things that are happening on an endpoint and make sure that you are able to kick off automatic remediation and be forward-looking and forward-looking and saying, okay, well, we've identified a threat in email, for example, but let's see where is that same threat maybe on an endpoint that had previously been saved to before that threat was weaponized, for example, and being able to do automatic remediation across those platforms as well, so that you can go pull messages from inboxes or quarantine files on a workstation, and get that full unified experience. So how does Microsoft support an efficient SOC center or SOC? I mentioned all those tools. You might have 50 or so security tools, maybe not as many in education, but point being, it's difficult when you're managing different products from different companies, different portals. Some of them might have integrations with one another. You're probably relying on some sort of a SIEM in order to build those correlations between products. And those correlations, they're complex. They might take hours, or more likely probably days, to make that correlation to see the extent of a specific attack. The Microsoft solution, we're looking to give you that single portal, make those correlations and those analytics in minutes, not hours or days. So a couple big items. We're seeing, of course, large number of attacks every year. That's just the world we live in these days. But what comes with those attacks is a vast increase of alerts. And those alerts might be very, very alarming in some cases, but the vast majority of those are probably just kind of day-to-day items, that day-to-day things that need to be taken care of. And alert fatigue, being overwhelmed with the quantity that's coming in from all sorts of different products, it can be overwhelming. And so being able to automate as much of that as possible, reduce the workload for whoever's working on security for you, and bring those down into relevant, meaningful bundles. We call them incidents. It's allowing you to see, all right, we have an incident. This incident has these components to it that are comprised of a handful of alerts. You can dig into that incident, and it helps you make the best of your time in triaging and knowing where you should spend your resources. And then lastly, we've got, of course, there's so many jobs unfilled in cybersecurity, and we all have insufficient resources. We're all wearing multiple hats. That's really leveraging the automatic self-healing components and leveraging the tools at hand when you need Microsoft there to give you a little extra help. So end-to-end security, kind of touching back on these 4 categories, just to give you a little further idea of what goes into them. So in identity and access management, think of single sign-on and being able to do your self-service password resets, being able to control who has access to what resource and what scenario with conditional access, being able to put control your admin access and give them just-in-time access to maybe a Teams admin only when they need it, so you don't have standing permissions, etc. You have your threat protection, whether it's your endpoint, your email, tying into your SIEM agent, whether that's Azure Sentinel, which is the Microsoft Cloud Native SIEM, or third-party SIEM, your information protection, being able to build sensitive info types. You've got all the ones that Microsoft provides. There's a big long list of all the standard sensitive info types, but you can actually build your own. Some great creative uses for that too in education is leveraging that for things like offensive language and harassing and bullying type behaviors, and applying those information types to policies, whether it's data loss prevention or when and where you need to provide encryption on files, or just outright blocking bad language or inappropriate behavior in that perspective. And then our cloud security, having our CASB, the Cloud Access Security Broker, to protect your apps, your web apps, your on-prem apps, and even your security posture in Azure and other clouds as well, and kind of seeing inside of, all right, we've got these VMs with access, these they have this vulnerability open to them, and being able to identify that consistently and help protect you there. So let's translate this into the real world and some real examples here. Now, remote learning, it's changed the world this last year. Kind of overnight, we had billions of students shifting to how do we make education work when we can't be together with one another in person as much as we'd all like. We had 183,000 tenants worldwide turned on for teams in education at a very fast pace, and saw a weekly increase of about 300% about a year ago now for Teams Mobile. So people aren't just sitting at home in front of their desk. They're kind of moving around. We look at commutes different, but they're leveraging mobile technologies quite heavily. So enabling access. This is the Microsoft App Launcher. This is something that's often maybe not known by a lot of our schools, but Microsoft Azure Active Directory has an application launcher. It's called My Apps, built right into the portal there. You can create your own different categories, these tabs on the top for Contoso, sales and marketing, productivity. This can be, you can customize and create those for your needs. You can apply policies so that your students see certain apps, your faculty sees other apps, maybe your HR department sees another set of apps, and they don't overlap. They only are presented the apps that they have access to, the apps they need for their specific function. So Azure Active Directory, it's a great product, and it's truly a full-fledged single sign-on provider, full-fledged identity provider. It's not just the thing you turn on to enable Office 365. You can integrate your SAML apps, your OAuth, OpenID Connect apps into Azure Active Directory. You can build your own applications and follow its industry standard SAML protocol. Follow those protocols, integrate those with Azure AD, and authenticate to them with a single sign-on experience. You can connect your on-premises web apps. So common problem about a year ago when all of this started was VPN overload. A lot of schools, a lot of companies, they had web apps, legacy apps that required you to be on-prem to get access to. And if you weren't on-prem, you had to VPN in to get access to them. Again, that goes back to that old network-based methodology of if you're on the VPN, then you can have access to this. Azure Active Directory and something called Azure App Proxy is a way to allow you to publish those legacy on-prem apps securely, safely, treat them like a modern cloud application, but without having to open firewalls. It's all outbound connections. That's the great thing about Azure App Proxy. So you can wrap all of these great security features with Microsoft 365 around legacy old apps that never in a million years were intended to have that kind of security. And you can start using conditional access and application control to protect those alongside of the other cloud applications you're using, whether it's OneDrive or Exchange Online or Dropbox, etc. So going forward a little bit with conditional access, this is where those signals all come into play. And you could almost think of them kind of like firewall rules. You're building rule sets for different access to different products, different components, different data types, depending on that user, the location they're coming from. Is it an anonymous IP address? Is it a Tor network? What is the risk of that user? Have their credentials been found on the dark web recently? Are those valid? What device are they coming from? Is it a managed device? Is it a non-managed device? If it's a personal device, do we want to give them a different experience? We're getting those real-time detectors of maybe this is an impossible travel scenario. James here is logging in from Washington, but we're also seeing some connections from Angola trying to download a bunch of his data from OneDrive. That's going to increase things like risk scores. And then also applications. What resource are you ultimately trying to get to? Are you trying to get to your email, where maybe, okay, that's allowed from a personal device? Or are you trying to get into that HR database or student information system where we might want to be a little bit more restrictive on that? So you take all of those signals, all of that insight, and you build that outcome. What do you want to happen in that specific scenario? Whether it's allowing access or blocking it outright, or maybe you need to require MFA. So you could have rules that, you know what, if you're on a managed device, we manage it in Intune, it's compliant, it's running all of our endpoint detection and response capabilities, it's in good health, you're coming from the US, maybe you don't need an MFA to get into your email. But as soon as you come in, maybe you're on your personal device, you're just trying to check your webmail real quick, Well, in that case, you might want to prompt them for MFA. Or in other scenarios, you might limit access, where you could say, all right, well, we're going to allow you access to this, but we're going to monitor you a little bit closer. And we're also not going to let you download anything, for example, or that could be related to your sensitive info types, and just monitor that session for if any sensitive info types are being leveraged in that web app. Or lastly, just doing a monitor only session, like saying, well, we're not going to impose any restrictions, but we still want to look at you a little closer and make sure everything is good and have better insight into that specific scenario. And that applies, again, to all your apps and data. It's not just the Office 365 world. You can put these policies on your access to Google Drive or Adobe Creative Cloud, or again, your on-premises apps through Azure App Proxy. Next part is enabling access governance. So really this is talking about identity life cycles and how you can manage your identities within Azure Active Directory from basically creation, where it's provisioned from a student information system, to maybe switching from a student to a student worker, or from a faculty member in HR moving to finance. That life cycle as they move jobs all the way to when they leave your school. Access life cycles, doing kind of regular auditing and reviews of, all right, well, as this person's moving around to different job functions, how do we automate and how do we automate dynamically their access, making sure that they have access to the things they need when they need it, but also making sure that you're removing access to stuff that they no longer need to be involved in. And then privileged access. This is more focused around administrators and just-in-time permissioning, where you can provide an admin a permission to your systems when they need it, all traceable and auditable, in a just-in-time fashion. So instead of having permissions standing on a user account where you have to worry if that user account's compromised, that user is going to have the keys to the kingdom, with privileged identity management, or privileged access, you're able to assign those admin permissions just in time when they need it, associated to a ticket, associated to approvals if you want to implement that too, so that you can control that a little bit deeper. So how does this, what are the common questions? What does this solve? And so things that might come to mind is you're looking for endpoint solutions. I need a multi-platform solution that covers endpoints from both things that we know of to the unknown threats, those zero-day threats out there. Another common thing is, how do I handle this? I'm a team of one. I can't. Is there something that can help me react? I'm kind of alone here wearing multiple hats. How can I be the most efficient in my job? Another one being, how do you be more proactive? What can I do to be proactive and reduce risk across my devices instead of a reactive stance, kind of patching and fixing the threats that are out there? So with Microsoft Defender for Endpoints, we addressed that first one. How do you be proactive and lower that risk? That's part of threat and vulnerability management. What that's doing is a real-time continual discovery of the applications that are on your managed devices and your workstations. What's installed on it, basically? What are the threats associated to those applications? Do you have a copy of Adobe Reader that has a vulnerability associated to it? Being able to identify industry threat analytics to applications in your environment. So that threat may not have been exploited in your environment yet, but you can be ahead of the game, see what's hitting the world, what's hitting your industry, and map that to your exact workstations and implement updates, implement cases. You can submit tickets to Intune or ServiceNow if you have other teams managing your devices, where they can then go send that update, get that Adobe Reader up to date, or whatever other application where a vulnerability may have been identified for. But it's a great way you can correlate those very real emerging threats across the world, correlate that to your environment, and be able to proactively plug those holes, close those security vulnerabilities before you're actually impacted. Next component is really, how do you prevent malicious activities? The first part of that is hardening your workstations. We call that attack surface reduction. Being able to add rules where you're blocking unwanted behavior. Things that really don't impact, probably, I mean, conservatively, you could say 80% of your users, probably even higher than that. Like disabling things like allowing Office macros to launch sub-processes that talk to external networks, allowing Office documents to make registry changes or launch sub-processes, things of that nature, where you can harden the environment. You can map those again back to emerging threats and where it's most beneficial with the least amount of impact. You can get insight on the potential impact of turning some of this stuff on before you actually do it. You can enable things like web content filtering. That's fantastic in allowing you to go select different categories, whether it's inappropriate content or maybe it's gaming sites or peer-to-peer file sharing networks. You can grab different categories and block that kind of content from being accessed from your workstations. Same thing with networks and blocking or allowing specific networks that are appropriate. Controlled folder access, that's fantastic for ransomware at a local level. So you can control important folders, whether it's a system folder or other folders on your workstations that are important in your environment that you want extra protection to prevent other services from having access to them. The other half of that is next generation protection. This is kind of a fancy way of saying antivirus. We call it next gen protection because it's not the Windows Defender you think of from 6, 7, 8 years ago. This has been rewritten from scratch. It's a modern cloud-based antivirus solution that leverages the power of both local machine learning and cloud machine learning to make sure that you have the most up-to-date insight of threats out there. So next-gen protection, that's your advanced modern antivirus behavior-based scanning of threats on your machine. Then we're going back to detecting attacks. So a little bit more reactive, basically allowing you to do endpoint detection and response. Advanced deep level analysis in the attacks in your environment, how they're proliferating, having deep sensors, creating a timeline of all actions that occurred so that you can see that full story of a attack from the original point of an email coming in and being opened to what that file did when it was opened. It launched a or enabled a macro. That macro went out, went to an external network. Maybe it grabbed a file and downloaded it to your workstation, which then kicked off a process that created a scheduled task. It's walking back all of those actions, every action that happened on that workstation, so that you can tell that entire story and identify the big picture of the attack, not just the end result. So you could start with that detection, that end result, and walk it back to see every component and what PowerShell command was executed with the switches associated to tell that big story. And then the automatic investigation remediation, alleviating the workload of your security team as much as possible by doing remediation on the endpoints, getting that workstation back into good health. It's not good enough just to isolate a device. You need to get that workstation back to good health in the most efficient method possible. And automatic remediation is the way to do that, so that when threats are identified and seen across multiple devices, you can go have that automatic remediation kick off and quarantine or mitigate that threat live and getting that user back to good, healthy standing. And then, of course, our threat experts, really, they're there to help do both proactive and reactive hunting of threats in your environment when you need assistance. Again, just to reiterate here on the bottom, this is cross-platform. So, of course, it's built in and not bolted onto Windows. It's a great experience there, but we of course support Windows Server. We have Mac support. You have Linux and Linux server support. You've got Android, and like I mentioned earlier, iOS is currently in preview for your endpoint protection. So moving on to some other categories. Looking at data protection. How do I protect my users from malicious emails and attachments? How might you protect users from links that are not necessarily coming in from email, but might be passed around from Teams, or when you have guest accounts connecting in like we do today? How do you make sure those are still protected? And then how can I train users, target them internally to see who's most likely to click a bad link or fall for a phishing campaign? And then lastly, how do I protect against those phishing campaigns? Those are common questions you get. So starting off with protecting our mail flow and phishing emails, you're leveraging things like safe attachments and our anti-phishing policies and safe links. So safe links is rewriting your URLs so that at the time of click, no matter when that is, a minute, day, year, or later, that click, it's reviewing the site you're going to and making sure that it's safe. Safe attachments is doing the detonation chamber of your attachments to look at behavior of that attachment, what it's doing to make sure that is safe. Now, goes through those scans, emails delivered, you get that user click protection again, so it doesn't really matter when they click it, they're protected with safe links. If that URL was weaponized post-delivery, common tactic. So take a link, make it benign, send it, blast it out to a bunch of people, and it gets delivered because it's benign. There's no reason to block it up front. But then an attacker might weaponize that URL an hour later or sometime later. So now instead of being a benign link, it's going to a site that's trying to do a phishing campaign. Well, once that's identified, once that link has been seen as weaponized, you want to go back and remove all aspects of that link where it was delivered in your environment. That's where 0-hour auto purge comes into play, pulling those messages back post-delivery that have now been weaponized and now pose a threat. Now, integrating that into post-breach, you may have a user compromised, and really you have both your automatic investigation response components where things like Zap get triggered, and you can expand that. So maybe that email or document was identified and removed with Zap, but now you want to look at that endpoint saying, all right, well, where did people download this attachment before it was weaponized? You want to trigger that with a different product from Defender for Endpoint to make sure your workstations are protected too. That's part of the automatic investigation response. We also have the manual hunting. So as you need to kind of run manual queries and deep dive in, you have all of those tools and capabilities available to you too to perform that remediation. But this isn't just email. That's what I love about Defender for Office 365 is it is built into your Office app. So Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Teams, Outlook, your protection's built in across all of those. So as you're in Excel and pasting a link, that's protected with safe links. As you're putting that content, those files in cloud storage from OneDrive to SharePoint, those files are protected there. If they're identified later as being weaponized, that automatic remediation is going to go protect that file in your OneDrive, mark it as a malicious file and quarantine it for you so that it can't infiltrate your users there. And then last component is our attack simulation, being able to run realistic simulated attacks on your end users that are safe, but are educational opportunities where you can identify who needs a little extra help and give them some training and content and educate them how to not fall victim to similar attacks when it's a real thing coming in from the outside world. So next group of problems. I need to make sure that my sensitive data isn't sent externally and that it's only really accessible from those that need to have access to it, and they need to have it easily. You want to be able to quickly respond, or we move to quickly respond to pandemics, and now we want to understand what type of data is out there and make sure that it's classified and protected as appropriate as quickly as possible. Lastly, might want to make sure that your data is protected as fast as possible, no matter where that file goes. So you might not have control over. Data loss prevention is great, where, all right, someone's emailed a file with social security numbers. We can detect that. You can block that. That's easy. But what if it was in a file and they accidentally copied it to a public file share, or they put it on a USB key and walked away with it and dropped it in a parking lot? You still want that data in those files protected. So way we do that, we've got a unified labeling platform. You may have heard terms like DLP and AIP, and what does it mean? Where do they come into play? And I like to think of those as working hand in hand. So DLP is data loss prevention. AIP is Azure Information Protection. Data loss prevention, easy way to think of that, is protecting files in transit. So as you email it, as you share a link out, or share that content out from Teams or OneDrive or SharePoint to other people, it's that in-transit action is where data loss prevention comes into play. Azure Information Protection comes into play at the file level. So being able to detect that there's sensitive information in that file as you're creating it, or even as it's at rest, where that may exist in your environment already, and being able to protect and classify, encrypt, restrict access, put time limits on it. That's Azure Information Protection at the file level component. You probably don't need to worry about those designations too much. The takeaway here is they use a unified labeling platform so that the classification types you've built out can be used across this entire stack, and even with third-party services when you start integrating with cloud app security. So you can integrate the same unified labeling from the DLP and AIP engines for Box and Dropbox and Google Drive and other third-party products there too. You want to make sure, this falls across different avenues. So first off, on-prem, that's actually probably the little known one, and where we've made some recent investments and announcements too. So we've had something called AIP Scanner for a little while now, and that was a way you could deploy a little agent on-prem and scan things like your on-prem SharePoint repositories, or scan your on-prem network file shares, and protect that content, identify it, encrypt it where necessary. That was a huge change. But recently, we've expanded upon that, and there's kind of using that same mechanism with AIP Scanner, we have data loss prevention capabilities for on-prem now, saying, all right, well, we've found this data that's sensitive on a network share, but if someone goes and copies and tries to paste that to a different location that maybe isn't allowed for that sensitivity of content, be able to take action in that case too. Of course, Microsoft 365 apps, cross-platform, whether it's the apps on your Windows PC or your mobile clients, protecting that sensitive data from apps too. Same thing, of course, for your cloud storage, whether it's SharePoint or Teams, Exchange Online or SharePoint. And then, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, those third parties where you have the same sensitive info type, same protection, cross-cloud and other platforms too. So you don't have to manage different DLP solutions. It's great. You have one unified solution that works for your Microsoft stuff as well as third-party products too. So next one we've got, all right, we want to be able to restrict users' access to applications or give them a different experience when they're not on managed devices. How do I do that? How do I get better visibility into the apps that my end users are leveraging outside of the Microsoft 365 platform? And then how do I detect changes or weird file downloads or where users are signing into your applications? How do I do all that? And this is where Microsoft Cloud App Security comes into play. So Microsoft Cloud App Security, again, is the Microsoft CASB, which is industry standard for cloud access security broker. Now, this gives you the ability, of course, like a traditional CASB, you can ingest firewall and proxy logs to help you discover shadow IT and cloud apps that are being used. But those depend on the network again. And kind of as we talked about earlier on, the networks, it's hard to depend on the network you're on to provide security. A unique ingestion point Microsoft has is the Microsoft Defender endpoint protection is another sensor for Microsoft Cloud App Security to discover shadow IT. So when you have Defender on your machines and your users are going through their normal day, normal behavior, it doesn't matter if they're on your network. It doesn't matter if they're on your VPN. They could be at home. They could be at Starbucks. They could be at a hotel. The network doesn't matter. The VPN doesn't matter. You're getting insight into the apps they're using and the services they're using from real-time detectors right from that feed. So it's a really powerful way to extend your knowledge into the apps your end users are using, being able to identify and remediate what they can and can't use. You can sanction or unsanction them, and that's enforceable with Microsoft Defender for endpoints too. So if you say, you know what, our school, we've endorsed both OneDrive and Box, but you know what? Maybe you don't endorse Dropbox. You can designate that, and that rule set applies on the endpoint, and it doesn't matter the network they're coming from. So beyond that, talking into different cloud platforms, being able to do security assessments. We've got, of course, got that integrated into Microsoft Azure to help you look at that infrastructure, see where you might have security gaps, and give you suggestions on how you can increase your security in the Azure platform. Same goes for AWS and GCP, Google Cloud, to be able to get those same level of security insights. Now, 16,000 plus supported apps. I almost even hate giving a number there because that number is effectively infinite. This is, of course, including all of the apps that you might develop yourself. It's the SAML, OAuth, OpenID Connect apps you've integrated into Azure AD, but it's also those legacy apps. So we can, again, treat legacy on-prem web apps as cloud apps and give them that same level of session control and protection and insight you're getting for modern web apps. You can also do that to the legacy apps too. So a lot of availability on what you can integrate there. So kind of the life cycle here. It's always continuous, always looking at what's going on in your environment, seeing high level risk, limiting access, making sure you can't download or print or copy data because, all right, we're seeing a riskier session. Now that's analyzed against policies. It's updating based on behavior, seeing if that user risk needs to increase or decrease. And then it's logged for future analysis and kind of goes back in that circle of, all right, well, now what has changed in this session since last connected, and how do we want to reinforce our policies today? A little bit more on managed devices. You're probably familiar with Microsoft Intune and our mobile device management capabilities. We also have mobile application management. And the difference being mobile device management is kind of traditionally what you think of, where your device is registered and managed, and you take control of the whole device. You make sure encryption's in place, and you are enforcing your policies. But the downside of that is you're probably going to capture some personal stuff there too, whether they're using that device for personal photos or personal apps and things that you don't necessarily care about from a managed kind of school data perspective. Mobile application management allows you flexibility of restricting access and controlling the apps that are important to you without having to control the entire device. So you can segregate out here your teams and cloud apps and your company portal, things that are important to you where your data resides without having to touch the personal side too. So a lot of flexibility on how you manage, and you can mix and match. You can use the full device management for the assets that you own and provision, but then also allow options for personal devices and BYOD so that you can manage the apps that are important to you without having to manage the personal content that you really don't want to. So I think we're running out of time here a little bit, but kind of what does this look like all together? I'm just going to build that out. So modern attacks, we talked earlier about they're human driven and how they're targeted throughout your infrastructure. It could start as a phishing account that compromises an endpoint. That endpoint is then going to go look for other user accounts to compromise, whether it's brute force or they're doing credential harvesting. Maybe they move laterally. They're now hitting domain controllers, trying to do recon and get more and more information. Ultimately, getting that privileged account to compromise where they can compromise the domain, they can release ransomware, whatever payload that's driven. Those are the advanced human-driven components, but are also probably pulling data out of your environment too, and hopefully that doesn't end up on the news. But where all the products come into play, you have Defender for Office 365. That's kind of the front end for your email, your attachments, and your cloud storage. That's where that comes into play. Defender for Endpoint. That is working on the endpoints, the workstations, the servers that you have to make sure that exploits aren't being taken advantage of, and going and doing proactive management of vulnerabilities. You've got your Azure Identity Protection. That's looking at your cloud identities and making sure that credentials aren't for sale on the dark web that might be leveraged, or looking at sign-in risk or the networks are coming from that might be risky. You have Defender for Identity. Again, that's the on-prem component, looking for lateral movement, looking at connecting to your Active Directory accounts, your local on-prem accounts, seeing that lateral movement, that privilege escalation, the pass the hash type attacks. And then lastly, we have our cloud app security. That's where you're tying in the exfiltration of data, looking at behavioral trends, and identifying those risky behaviors. So back to this is our unified platform. It's actually even been updated a little bit more since this screenshot was taken, just last week or the week before. But this is where you wake up in the morning, you come into work or sign on to work at home these days, and you're getting that dashboard and you're able to triage alerts and incidents and what is important and significant in your environment, both from endpoints and email and threats from CASB, all here. It's a great experience, giving you really that efficient insight into your environment from a security perspective. So with that, actually, we came right down to the minute. I'm happy to hang on. I don't know if anyone has any questions, but if you haven't put them in the chat, you're more than welcome to come off mute if you'd like and ask questions or anything you might have. But thank you very much for joining me today. I appreciate everyone's time.
All right. And does anyone have any questions? If not, I am going to post something in the chat. All right. Let's do this. And this is going to be the link to the site. Let me see if I can get this a little bit more.
And actually, James, can we stop the recording? Then maybe some people will be less shy about questions if they don't want to be recorded.